My name is Laney Whitcanack, and I'm the CEO of Coro, Northern California. And I'm so excited to welcome everyone to our panel discussion today, focused on the future of our elections, campaigning, and our democracy. Coro was founded in the early 1940s by the head of a labor union and two Republicans. And our organization was built on the idea that our democracy is only as strong as our collective capacity to work and lead across differences. Coro's work centers on supporting and training and connecting leaders at all levels to foster a thriving democracy and to tackle society's biggest challenges together. It is in this spirit that we share today's conversation with all of you. I know for so many of us, after living through the most contentious US presidential election in modern history, we are left with many questions, many emotions, many opinions about candidates and policies and the future. And I say that because tonight, I want to just do a quick reminder to everyone that our specific focus is on how election 2020 will impact future campaigns and the electoral process and the health of our democracy, and also how it'll impact the future of leadership. So with that, I'm really excited to introduce our moderator for tonight. As Senior Political Advisor to Tom Steyer, Jenna Narayanan works to leverage political investments that encourage aligned investment across all sectors of the political playing field. Jenna helped stand up Next Gen America, which I know so many of you are familiar with, the largest youth registration and mobilization effort in the country, and founded and led Give Green, a political giving platform for donors who want to donate to candidates who support aggressive action on climate change. She has more than 18 years of experience in progressive politics, advising the country's top Democratic donors, and is a veteran of 3 presidential campaigns. And I'm also so proud to say that she's also one of our own Coro board members. And Jenna, you've been so incredibly generous with sharing your network with all of us tonight. So please join me in welcoming Jenna.
Hey, Laney, thank you so much for that introduction. I would like to clarify for everybody on the call that I have the honor of only working for losing presidential campaigns. So unlike other people on this call. So I want to thank you all for being here. As Laney said, my name is Jenna Narayanan, and I'm really excited to lead our conversation tonight. I've worked in politics for a long time, and I know how extra intense this campaign season has been for all of us. And when I say all of us, I'm not just talking about the people on this panel tonight or the people working on campaigns, but every single one of us who are on this call tonight. So I'm going to recommend that everybody take a nice deep breath, gonna breathe, and then we're going to move on. It's been nearly 2 weeks since the election, and I know all of us are trying to make sense of what we just experienced. My hope is that tonight we're going to leave the conversation with some new thinking, some new questions, some new insights about how we move forward. Each of the 4 panelists is someone that I respect immensely. And I think we're going to have a really fun, informative, and thought-provoking conversation. I know personally how much each of these people are committed to leadership, mentorship, and the health of our vibrant democracy. And so we may have differences of opinions on how we approach various issues and concerns, but I think we have far more in common than that which divides us. So with that, please join me in welcoming all of our panelists. I think you guys can all take yourselves off of video or onto video. Let's start with Joe Grogan. Joe is the former assistant to the president and director of the United States Domestic Policy Council. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with how titles work in the White House, assistant to the president is about as high as you can go. So we are really lucky to have him here tonight, and I really appreciate you coming and joining us. Joe was appointed as acting chief of staff, by acting chief of staff Mick Mulvaney, and worked from 2017 to January 2019 as a healthcare official in the Office of Management and Budget. He was appointed as a member of the White House Coronavirus Task Force back in January. He ended up leaving the White House in May 2020 and has just joined the board of directors of Verde Technologies. Joe is a long-standing expert in healthcare, both in and out of the government. I have friends on both sides of the aisle who have worked with him, and everybody speaks so highly of him and his professionalism and his leadership. So Joe, thank you for coming. I also want to say Joe has the distinct pleasure of being introduced to my husband Satish and me at a Halloween costume party in New Orleans. And he has promised me and assured me that the details of that party will remain classified. So thank you.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Next, I want to introduce Julie Chavez Rodriguez. Julie is the deputy campaign manager for the Biden-Harris campaign. Julie grew up in California, where I'm currently living for the last 5 years, in a very well-known family of American labor and civil rights activists. She is the granddaughter of American labor leader Cesar Chavez and the American labor activist Helen Fabela Chavez. From 2009 to 2017, Julie served in the Obama administration, working for the White House Secretary or the United States Secretary of the Interior, and then also the White House Office of Public Engagement. She was appointed state director for Kamala Harris in 2017, and then later served on Kamala's 2020 presidential campaign. In May, she was hired by the Biden presidential campaign as a senior advisor for political and coalitions. And in July, she was named as a deputy campaign manager. She is the highest ranking Latina working on the Biden campaign. And I have had the pleasure of getting to know her over the last couple of months and have an amazing amount of respect for the group of people she's brought together and the work she does. So Julie, thank you so much for joining us. I know you're just a tiny bit busy right now. So you taking the time to join this call today is a big deal, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Jenna.
Next is Jeff Weaver. Jeff, it was a senior advisor to the Bernie Sanders campaign during the 2016 and 2020 cycles. After the 2016 election, Jeff served as president of Our Revolution, which was the nonprofit established by Sanders, and that went until June 2017. Before the presidential run, Jeff was Sanders' chief of staff and congressional campaign manager. And fun fact, Jeff is also the owner of Victory Comics, a comic book store in Falls Church, Virginia. And his book, How Bernie Won Inside the Revolution That's Taking Back Our Country, was published in 2018. And I will say that when I asked Jeff to participate in this panel, his reply was, sounds fun. So I love it. Thank you so much for your enthusiasm and your excitement. It's contagious. Now, last but not least, we have Wendi Wallace, who is the Deputy Executive Director for the Democratic Governors Association, which we call the DGA. In this role, she serves as the liaison to sitting governors for the committee, as well as the point of contact for partner organizations. Before joining the DGA team, she served as political outreach director for Planned Parenthood Action Fund. And then prior to that, Wendi was the manager and executive of the Executive Office and Board of Affairs at the Democracy Alliance, where she had the distinct pleasure of coming in and working with me each and every day, unable to get away from me. So in addition to her professional duties, Wendi also serves on the boards of the Alliance for Youth Action and the Pipeline Initiative. And she is one of my closest friends and was unable to say no to me when I asked her to do this. So thank you so much. I'm really happy to have you. So let's kick this all off. Today, we are going to focus on how we approach the work of democracy going forward. So I'm going to start out with a question, and I kind of want to have each of you guys answer it. The first one is, we've all worked on many, many campaigns. What are 3 words that describe the 2020 campaign experience? And how was this one different? And you can also answer what the impact of COVID was on that. Wendi, why don't we start with you? And you guys can all take yourself off mute if you want.
Great. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I'm super excited to go first on this question, given that I am the least experienced in terms of campaign experience on this call. So I will take all of the low-hanging fruit. Hope you guys are ready. I'm going to go with virtual is one word. I think also distant, even though it is somewhat the same as virtual. And let's see, my third word is chaotic. I think, are we expanding on our words or are we just saying words?
You can expand on your words.
Okay. I mean, I think there's like no way to downplay the impact that COVID had at all levels of the ballot. I also think, you know, in a presidential year, it's harder for down ballot races to break through. And that was only increased by your ability to, or by the inability to kind of go out, shake people's hands, meet them in parking lots, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think distant, virtual, and chaotic is what I will go with.
Great. Joe, why don't you go next?
Yeah, I think what Wendi just said about about COVID, I don't know what word describes it, pandemical or whatever. Something that hung over the whole thing. So we should coin a new word for that. But I'm going to go with Wendy's notion on that, and I'll consult the dictionary and we'll embed a new word later on. Surprising. I don't think anybody who was involved in it predicted a lot of the different permutations that came out, the House, the Senate, and the White House, and a number of the different sub-stories that occurred. So I'm going to go with surprising. And then somewhat anticlimactic in the sense that there was no great sea change or people, were stocking up on ammunition and firearms and Molotov cocktails, and that didn't happen either. So, and maybe the corollary to anticlimactic, this might be cheating, but peaceful, which I think we can all be grateful for.
Jeff, Julie?
Julie, go ahead.
I'll take, I think one, diverse. I feel like this was in terms of campaign staff, because it was such a huge primary that it really opened up opportunities for, I think, a lot of diverse staff to step into leadership roles. Creative, because we had to be, given COVID and the virtual nature of it. I mean, who would have thought that most of us would be sitting in our living room most of the time, kind of running a national campaign separate from one another. But, down to the car rallies that we kind of ended with, I think, we really tried to figure out how to, make sure that we were showing the kind of energy that was out there. And then, gosh, what's the third word? I mean, the third word, maybe it's just COVID. Maybe that's the word that we use, because I feel like it impacted everything from, our ability to, and when we, were able to do more traditional campaigning, like knocking on the doors, to, to our travel and to everything that we did. I feel like there was a new kind of COVID lens that, no matter what we were talking about, that we just had to really make sure that we were thinking through holistically. So those are my three.
So my first word would be historic. I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to maybe go with one word and talk about it in three different ways. It was historic, certainly in the turnout that we saw. Joe Biden has gotten more votes than anybody else running for president in the history of our country. And I think Donald Trump has gotten the second most votes of anybody running for president in this country in this election. So the turnout and the interest in this election was overwhelming, even in the era of COVID and all of the obstacles that posed to people voting, along with all the other challenges that people normally face around voting, including voter suppression and just the normal difficulties of voting. It was also a historic in the sense that was talked about, with young people, people of color coming out and really, I think for the first time, changing the battlefield in some of these states which have been considered red for so long. And it really, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit more later about, just talk about politics going forward. Georgia, if you look at Georgia and Arizona, two states where there has been a tremendous amount of year in and year out organizing on the ground among people. And then, you layer that with an incredible amount of resources that Democrats and Republicans had, but the tremendous amount of resources that Democrats had to put on TV and other places. And it was that mixture which was explosive and really overturning the conventional wisdom about what was possible in those states. And I hope as we go forward, and if you look at states where we spend a lot of money, Democrats spend a lot of money, South Carolina and Iowa and other places where that ongoing organization is not going on, we didn't have as much success. And so I think there's a lesson there in terms of what our strategy as Democrats has to be going forward if we're going to turn some of these other states blue as well. And that's really activating the grassroots and then coupling that with this tremendous amount of resources that, folks were getting, senators were getting $80 million, $70 million, candidates for the United States Senate, are really crazy. And the other way it was historic is, certainly from people on the Democratic side, and I'm trying, and given the confines of this discussion, to sort of separate myself from my own politics and experience and talk about it, more from a 30,000 foot level. Yeah, I think there was a real sense on the Democratic side that the Trump administration represented something different than we had seen before, and a real sense that it was sort of leading the country in a different direction that was unhealthy in terms of its impact on our democracy. And people really responded to that. You saw it in the suburbs, although, in truth, we turned out a lot of Democrats, we turned a lot of quote unquote anti-Trump Republicans, and those people are at the end of the day Republicans, and that, probably didn't help us down ballot. I'm not saying it wasn't a good strategy. I think it was a good strategy because I think the job number one was, from our perspective, was to beat Trump. But, going forward, we need a new strategy. And that is what I was talking about in Arizona and Georgia, which is energizing all of these young people and people of color and people who have been locked out of the political process going forward.
Yeah. That's actually a great kind of segue into one of my next questions, which was early in the campaign. How do you think the racial and ethnic and gender diversity of the Democratic candidates impacted campaign strategy for both Democrats and Republicans? Julie, do you want to go first on that one? I think.
Sure. I think in terms of the, Democratic Party, and at the time I was working on Kamala's campaign, I think that, the campaign that we ran was one that was, really specific to kind of who she was and the, I think, unique kind of diversity that she helped to bring to the field. And she didn't just do that, right? Folks like Julian Castro did that as well. And, I feel like it was such a diverse field that it enabled so many people to be able to, come in and to Jeff's point, really organize, based on those opportunities. We did, she was the first candidate to be a graduate of an HBCU. And so we had a tremendous HBCU strategy that, had we had the resources to continue, I think would have been, really helpful in places like South Carolina in the primary. Also looking at the work that she had done in California, especially around, the issue of immigration and with the Latino community, and using that as an opportunity to connect with, more of the grassroots organizations in places like Nevada, where, she had some connections based on her Senate work. And so just really, being able to, I think, lean into so many different, areas and avenues, because we knew that was, that was the coalition that needed to be rebuilt in order to win 2020. And we were, I think, really crystal clear, from the beginning. And it was great to be able to join the Biden campaign and see that same, really focus and vision and understanding of the electorate that we needed to energize and that we needed to engage. And it's been great to see, Arizona in particular, because it's the state that I've spent a lot of time in and that I have roots in. And that, I remember the devastating impact of SB 1070. And at the time I was helping on the amicus brief strategy when it came to the Supreme Court. But that mobilized and energized a whole new generation of leaders, of groups, of folks that, from that moment were saying, today we march, tomorrow we vote. And they made that a reality and have built tremendous power. And so it was exciting to, see all of that fusion kind of come together. But, it came as a result of a really diverse, primary, and folks being able to show what is not just possible, but necessary in this moment.
Thanks. Joe, I think that I know you worked in the White House and not necessarily on the campaign, but I'd still love to hear your thoughts on it. President Trump made huge inroads. Well, he made inroads into the Latinx community, and especially among young Black men. we saw it as a real strategic strategy to reach out to those communities. And that was different than what we've seen in the past. Do you want to talk a little bit about do you think that had to do with the diverse candidates that we were seeing on the Democratic side? Was that a reaction to that or something different?
No, I don't think it was reaction to the candidates that the Democrats were fielding. I mean, criminal justice reform was something he pursued early on and was his first big legislative achievement along with tax reform. So it wasn't in response to the diversity on the Democratic side. I think too, the outreach to, or the popularity that he enjoyed with African-American males and some of the Latin community, it's an interesting thing to parse because he went after it in a different way than any Republican before. I worked in the Bush administration and they had all these different outreach programs and everything. And it was all tailored towards specific ethnic groups, huge Hispanic liaison efforts, African-American liaison efforts, and ultimately they failed. Trump went at it differently. And frankly, you look at criminal justice reform, it was really substantive. And it wasn't done in a pandering way, and it wasn't targeted just to African Americans. It was people who are getting screwed by the system, and disproportionately that happens to be African Americans. So they're going to be disproportionately benefited. But it wasn't done in the way that George W. Bush would have done it, for instance. He would have had some big, it would have been run out of the African-American liaison office or something like that. And Trump was inspired, frankly, by the Texans who had led on criminal justice reform in the state of Texas. So beyond that, I do think he went after these votes in a different way than anybody before. And people have to take notice of that in the Republican Party, that it's possible, and it's possible in a different way. He was lambasted every day and called a racist every day, numerous times on the major networks, and still he made improvements. At the same time, he lost ground among certain religious voters who, church-going or regularly church-going people, when he did a tremendous amount of outreach in that area. So that also is something that needs to be taken into consideration. I would, agree with Julie and Jeff about Georgia and Arizona, in the sense that one of the big things you need in politics really is hope. And what the Democrats just pulled off in Arizona and Georgia really is something they can pull on into the midterms and the next presidential election, to say we can turn traditionally red states blue with enough organizing and enough outreach. Now it remains to be seen, to Jeff's point, whether or not those people who went to the polls and made a conscious decision to split the ticket, vote against Trump but vote Republican down ballot, where do they shake out in 2 and 4 years, or do they show up again? But that's a very conscious decision to make that type of lever breakage. But I find it fascinating on the demographics and the diversity issue. I think people are going to be peeling this apart for not just weeks or months, but this is something that's going to be really studied for a long period of time, because it scrambled a lot of assumptions about voters.
Oh, thank you. Wendi, do you want to weigh in here from the governor's perspective and some of the state perspectives?
Sure. I think a lot of what has been said, I agree with. I think the one thing I will add from the state level is we saw engagement from communities of color, not only in terms of candidates and staffing, but also in terms of activism. And I think for us at the gubernatorial level and state ledge level, that was where sort of the rubber really met the road, particularly during the protest over the summer. And, I was getting calls from people saying, well, we're going to do this protest. We want the governor to show up. And you know, not everybody is comfortable doing that. Sometimes you are like, you get a governor who's like, hell yeah, I'm gonna throw on a mask and go out there. And then sometimes you're like, they're very timid and they're like, well, do you think people will respond to me meeting with the protesters, or what do you think I should do? And I think one of the things that will be interesting to see is the people that were activated and were marching in the streets. I think we saw a lot of those people turn out. Jeff referenced the high voter turnout that we saw. I think we saw that on both sides of the aisle, both protest, counter protest. We saw a lot of that turnout. And I'm interested to see how they either do or don't remain engaged, and what that will look like, and how they will focus on holding these electeds accountable in places where we've seen, particularly given that COVID is not over. I think people are going to want to see results on that, among other things.
That's awesome. Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the Democratic field this time was incredibly diverse. I mean, in every way that you can possibly imagine, race, gender, politics, sexuality. I mean, it really was, the Democratic stage looked like America, frankly. And I do think that that helps the Democratic Party. And I'm pretty confident that Joe Biden's administration that also looks like America. And I thought will help Democrats, because you know, when you talk about diversity, Candace is one thing, but you know, the diversity of the electorate I think is also important. And I think that oftentimes, you know, there are pockets of voters who are overlooked either entirely nationally or in some states. You know, I'll give you one example. You know, we knew we were going to be in a very fractured caucus in Iowa because there were so many candidates. We knew that there were 50,000 registered non-Republican Latinos in Iowa. Bernie Sanders happened to do incredibly well with Latinos, and 50,000 people in an Iowa caucus is a huge block of voters. You think of 50,000 people in Iowa, not that many. In the Iowa Democratic caucus, it is huge. You know, we had caucus sites that were set up at Latino community centers, in mosques, for Muslim voters. There's 5,000 Muslim voters in Iowa. And so, you know, we consciously reached out to communities and met people where they were, not just politically, but physically. And I think that that had a lot to do with the success that we had in Iowa and in Nevada, frankly.
Awesome. Yeah.
So you've got to go to voters. If you want voters' votes, it's not enough to say, oh, black voters should vote Democratic, or Latino voters should vote Democratic, or any group of voters should vote Democratic. You've actually got to go out and talk to them, explain to them why it does matter to them that they vote Democratic, or if you're a Republican on the Republican side. But you've got to ask them for their vote, and you've got 2 weeks of TV at the end of the election cycle. That's an ongoing year in and year out process that the party has, frankly, in recent years, not really done a great job at.
There's been a lot of hand wringing on both sides, I think, about how you communicate with people when it's not in the middle of an election season. People are like, I don't know from you for years. And I think, you know, that's one of the things some of President Trump's people feel like they like, is that he speaks directly to them with Twitter. And I think that is something that on the Democratic side, we sometimes discount. So turning to talking a little bit more about Trump, how did the Trump presidency and the Trump campaign of 2016 impact the 2020 campaign strategy thinking for Democrats and Republicans? And I'm going to let Joe go first on this one, because I feel like I want to hear what he has to say.
Well, I think there was a sense in the White House and the campaign, and I disagree with it, that he could run the same campaign that he ran in 2016, only more so. And by that, I mean, he got torn up by not having a healthcare plan. And frankly, we had one that we had developed, but the decision was made not to go out with it because it was going to be viewed as a target. There were other failures to understand that as an incumbent, things are going to be, you're going to be held to a different standard. Now, at the same time, and then the other thing is the changes in the voting rules. I don't think they really contended with the mail-in voting changes, the early voting changes, much of which was done in response to COVID. But to be frank, a lot of it was done at the behest of Democrats to get more Democratic voters into the system, which, you know, you just have to contend with. And rather than wringing your hands and complaining about vote by mail or early voting, you've got to figure out how to win at it. And he ran the same drill at the end, interrupted by his COVID diagnosis, which was to pound these states with a tremendous amount of in-person rallies. You know, as Wendi said in the beginning, you know, COVID hung over this election from the beginning. I mean, I personally believe that if COVID had not hit and Trump had run against Biden, Trump would have crushed him. And had he not gotten the diagnosis, he might have gotten enough terminal velocity at the end. I'm not saying that he would have pulled it out, but he really dropped it into the sixth gear. When he got out of Walter Reed and got back to the rallies, it was a tremendous pace, and he was gaining momentum, but he ran out of time. So I think a few of those things, there was a lack of. It's always difficult when you're really successful at something to rejigger your strategy. It's difficult in sports, you know, football teams trying to figure out, well, this is how I won last season, this is how I'm going to win this season. Any type of team needs to figure out what the new strategy is. And I don't think the campaign fully came to grips with the fact that as an incumbent, it's a different campaign. With COVID, it's a different campaign than they ran in 2016.
Julie, being on the other side of things, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
You know, I mean, we were able to more broadly, right, run on his record and actually, you know, have something to be able to sort of point to and to focus on. I think, you know, seeing and understanding how voters were impacted by COVID was one that was definitely, you know, an important kind of, you know, ongoing message that we continue to really focus in on, and tying that to, you know, the broader sort of push for healthcare, which we saw have a real impact politically in the 2018 cycle. And so, you know, making sure that we continue to really focus on COVID. And then knowing that we had some vulnerabilities on the economy, but that we had a good case to be able to make. So making sure that we were leaning in there. And then when it came to really focusing in on the various coalitions of voters that we wanted to, you know, really engage and energize, you know, with the Latino community, I'll dissect that a little bit. You know, in Arizona, we made sure to remind folks sort of how Trump launched his campaign and the, you know, attacks on the community. In, you know, Orlando, we really spoke to the Puerto Rican community about the, you know, impact of the aftermath of Hurricane Maria and you know, the real inability to address some of the issues there. And so we made sure that we, you know, really focused in on the record and had, I think, some, you know, important contrast opportunities there to be able to show what a difference or what the different sort of Biden administration and approach would really look like.
Jeff, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this, so I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Well, I do think a lot of what Joe had to say about the Trump strategy, I think, is right. You know, you cannot run for re-election in the same way that you run the first time around, especially when you're running as an outsider, right? He ran as an outsider with no political record, and then he comes into this election and he does have a record. And I also agree that if not for COVID, the fundamentals of the race would have been, I mean, just incredibly different. And, you know, whether Trump would have prevailed or not, we'll never know. Would Bernie have won in 2016? We'll never know that either. All of these unanswered questions without the Wayback Machine. But I do think that the fundamentals of the race would have been dramatically different, and that it probably would have been a better playing field for Trump. Although, you know, Democrats typically deploy door knockers all around. Jenna, as you know this, door knockers all around the country. They spend millions and millions and millions of dollars knocking on doors and talking to voters, which they did not do this time because of COVID, and there was some complaints from some quarters that was not being done, but certainly I think most people understood why it was not. And the Trump folks were out actually banging on doors around the country, and I think that was an advantage for them that we gave up in an effort to avoid the COVID thing. But from our perspective, Bernie Sanders was very personally moved, and again, I'm trying to be academic about this. Bernie Sanders felt very personally, as someone whose family had died in the Holocaust, that he really felt that this country was going in the wrong direction, that Trump represented, if not Trump himself, but Trump represented the doorway to something very dark and ugly. There has never been a radical political revolution in advanced industrial democracy in the 21st or 20th century that was not a rightward one. And he was very concerned that we defeat Trump and what Trump represents. And I think you saw that during his primary campaign. I think you saw it in his aggressive support for Joe Biden. I ran a pro-Biden super PAC during the after the primaries were over. So all of us were pushing very hard on Trump. And look, this election was all about Trump. And in 2018, again, we talked about ticket splitters. In 2018, people in the suburbs were disgusted with Trump. They went out and voted for the Democratic congressional candidates. In 2020, they had the opportunity to actually vote against Trump himself, and then were freed up to vote for Republican congressional candidates. I think that was part of what happened as well. There's a lot of sharp elbows now on the Democratic side about what actually happened and who's responsible, and are they too far left? Are they too far to the center? Are they too far? And although if you listen to the talking points, if you get below the talking points, there's a tremendous amount of agreement on what we should do going forward. But this election was fundamentally about Trump. And it governed everything.
Wendi, from the state side, you come at this from a slightly different perspective. And Jeff talked about the ticket splitters and people, voting possibly against Trump. What did you see at the state level? Do you agree with that?
No, I mean, the results, the scoreboard shows what Jeff is saying is accurate. The one thing I will say is when we talk about President Trump's impact from 2016 until now, I think one of the things that we saw was 2017 and 18 and even 19, even though you weren't running against Trump, he wasn't on the ticket, you were running against Trump. Right, you're running a statewide race. It's against Trump. We saw this in Louisiana is I think one of the great examples, as is Kentucky, where it's being telegraphed into the state. The president is in state campaigning for Republicans, and you're fighting this uphill battle against that. And I think this may be an unpopular opinion, and I might change it in another 2 weeks when I've had time to marinate on it a little bit, so don't hold me to it. But I actually think that you suffer in a situation where Trump is actually on the ballot, because then you get exactly what Jeff is talking about. A person who you in 2017 or 18, you can rile up and say, this person, this Democrat that's running for governor is going to help you stand up to Trump. You don't need that middleman in 2020. You're standing up to Trump yourself. You're voting for Joe Biden, and then you vote for whatever Republican down ballot because you feel like, whew, I did my part, like the country's going in the wrong direction, but I've already voted against him. And so I don't know if that theory will hold up, but I do think it's worth looking at. And also there was a pervasive impact in the years in between that we just didn't see in the same way in 2020. So that is what I'll say about that.
Joe, I want to give you a second to respond to anything. I don't want you to feel like it's 3 against 1 here. So if there's anything you wanted to say in response to everything.
No, it's all good. I mean, I'm a Republican from Albany, New York. So I'm perfectly, and I live in Washington, D.C. I'm part of the 5% who votes Republican every year. So I'm these actually are pretty good odds.
All right. Well, let's switch and talk really briefly about Trump's refusal to concede based on the media calling the election. what parts of campaign 2020 might strengthen or weaken our democracy going forward? Jeff, you want to take this one first?
Sure. This is actually an issue that Senator Sanders was talking about, pretty early on, relative to when other people were talking about it. Trump was indicating in interviews with Chris Wallace and Fox and other places that, he would step down after the election if it was a fair election, if he, was convinced it was not full of fraud. And, even to today, with what we saw, I don't know if folks have seen that foreign governments typically contact the president-elect through the State Department, and those communications are languishing at the State Department because they refuse to pass them along to the Biden campaign and to facilitate those contacts between Joe Biden, President-elect Biden, and foreign leaders. The GSA has not helped with the transition. Trump, this is not I don't think even a judgment. Trump has sort of authoritarian tendencies. He just does. It's part of his personality. And he has not accepted what everybody else in America has accepted, except for the few people who followed Steve Bannon to whatever channel he is now on, believing that somehow Trump was defrauded of the election, not just in Pennsylvania, but apparently in Arizona and Nevada and a whole host of others. This widespread conspiracy that permeated the nation and the electoral process to deny Trump a re-election, when the truth of the matter is that he lost by millions and millions of votes. And it is fortunate, actually, for the country that Biden did not win by just one state, where they could have put up the kind of offensive that was put up against Al Gore in Florida in 2000. So we're in a very fortunate position that Joe Biden and his capable team delivered a victory that was achieved through multiple states and multiple paths. So congratulations to Julie. Julie and I have obviously not talked about any of this. We were on opposite sides of the wall, but hopefully at some point, Julie, when COVID is lifted, we can sit down and share our perspectives.
Julie, you want to go next?
I would love to, and I look forward to it. I think that my hope is that we kind of get back to a little bit more of business as usual moving forward. I think that right now, I think some of the challenges that we're facing in terms of the lack of engagement on transition are while they're not sort of insignificant, I think we're not at a threshold point, but I don't think we want to get close to that point. And so my hope is that we can kind of smooth out this transition and not really sort of impact and I think jeopardize what has been such a historical kind of process that underscores our democracy and I think really really kind of I think sets us apart, right, and continues to keep us this real sort of a beacon of democracy. And so I'm hopeful about that. I think that there's obviously some I think important and urgent work that needs to happen moving forward, just to make sure that folks really see a level of and a level of integrity kind of across the board. And I know that that's extremely important to the president-elect and to the vice president-elect. And it's also, something that I know we really, I felt like set an important bar around during the Obama-Biden administration and one that I would imagine will continue moving forward. So,
Joe, what do you think? What parts of the campaign might strengthen or weaken our democracy going forward with this?
Well, I do think we've got a little bit of time, and I think the president is well within his rights to ask for audits and for legal principles to be vindicated. I believe that Governor Wolf in Pennsylvania does not have the right to change the voting rules right before Election Day. The U.S. Constitution is clear that needs to be done through the legislature. Now, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled that it was fine, but I don't think that it's right. And I think the president's got well within his rights to pursue that legal challenge. I agree with Jeff that it won't change the ultimate result, but and I really hope we get to a good transition. But I got to tell you, I was at President Trump's inauguration, and I walked off from the Capitol with my wife, and we were going to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue to a great restaurant there, one of my favorites, Momofuku, which has since shut down because of the riots. And there were cars on fire on Pennsylvania Avenue. And I called Momofuku and said, can my wife and I come in for lunch? And they said, no, we're shutting down because the window just got smashed. I didn't see a peaceful transition. The president hadn't even crossed the threshold at the White House at that point. And I'm glad Jeff brought up the Al Gore, Florida, George W. Bush experience, because the papers went down there and audited it. And guess what? Bush won that election. And I've still got to hear about how Al Gore had that election stolen from him. I still got to hear about how Reagan had an October surprise. And I don't think it's helped Democrats over the years. It'll be interesting to see how Trump's supporters shift from this. They're saying, a high proportion of them think the election was stolen. That does not necessarily help the Republican Party motivate them to be involved in the electoral process moving forward and to win next time. If you think that the system is rigged, you frequently check out of the system. I don't think it helps. I don't think it helped Democrats when they perpetuate this narrative that various presidents were elected illegitimately. So I don't think it necessarily helps Republicans to stay in the game if this goes on very long and President Trump out of office begins to, repeatedly perpetuates the idea that this was stolen from him. I do hope that we do not do to Biden what was done to Trump as far as like the Russia investigation and that whole narrative and the Mueller this and everything like that. I hope we are beyond that. I'm not a vindictive person. I'll be honest with you. I thought that whole situation and what Michael Flynn is still going through is outrageous on a human level. That what happened to him was absolutely vile, and anybody who's suspicious of the police and law enforcement should be deeply suspicious and sympathetic to what happened to him and he's still going through. I hope we're done with that as a country and we can get to a point where we have full confidence in the electoral process. We have full confidence in the fact that, every once in a while, something weird may happen, but overall, we have integrity of our elections. And when we lose, we should move on and we shouldn't whine about it, whether we're on the Republican or the Democratic side. We shouldn't be violent. We shouldn't light cars on fire or threaten to if our candidate doesn't win.
Wendi, do you want to give any last words on this before we're going to switch to a question around leadership?
I don't have much to add on this. I will say, I think more people being involved in the democratic process is always positive, even if they don't agree with me. So I view us as being at a turning point. And I think Joe is right on a lot of the pieces of, I hope that we can learn from this moment and grow from it, but that doesn't happen on its own. And so I think the attitudes around what is happening with this election and with these presidencies reflects leadership. And so it is important for people who have megaphones and who have a voice to use that to help us move forward to the next thing. I know, I was watching a sports documentary, and one of the coaches said, you have 24 hours, everyone on this team has 24 hours, whether we win or lose, to gloat, agonize over the defeat, and then we move on. We're back in the gym. We are shooting baskets. And I think that as both parties, we would do well to remember something like that, analyze what happened, but move forward in a positive way.
Well, on that note, let's move over to a question around leadership. So Coro is an organization focused on leadership development. How does this election cycle impact what is required of future leaders on a national stage? Julie, you want to take this one first, and then we'll go to Jeff?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think this moment sort of calls for what I kind of consider like integrous leadership, and really, being able to, have folks, I think, who are able to just, demonstrate a level of real, I think, kind of commitment to kind of the broader public service and to restoring people's faith in government. I think, some of the challenges and experiences that people have had with COVID, whether it's from a public health perspective or an economic perspective, I think has really, strained people's faith and the ability for, when we're in crisis, for there to be, kind of effective leadership to be able to respond and to, to address and answer the moment. And so I think that that's sort of what all of us are kind of called to right now, whether we're working, whatever kind of level of government, but also on the national stage. Like there's so many ways in which we've been impacted by the pandemic, and the need for all of us to also be a part of reopening safely and smartly and our recovery. And so I see that as being sort of the kind of call for leadership right now.
Jeff, what do you think?
Yeah, look, I think what is needed at this time in terms of leadership is leadership that is able to interact with all the voices of all of the people that they represent in whatever leadership capacity they are. You look at the Democratic Party, there's like this huge new fully awakened youth in America who are coming into the Democratic Party. Look at the exit polls in Georgia. The exit polls, a little bit sketchy, but it showed the youth under 30 were 21% of the turnout in Georgia. Tremendous impact of youth voters in the Georgia election. And that's happening all over the place. And so leaders have to be able to meet the people they're leading. I don't want to call them the followers, but the people they're leading. And to be able to bring those folks together into sort of cohesive organization. And that's much more challenging than it seems that it's on its face. And anybody who's ever been involved in either Republican, I'm sure it's true on the Republican side, or Democratic politics, institutional politics, understands the difficulty of sort of holding together a big and unwieldy coalition that then has to act in concert, even though one segment of the party is upset at the other one over this or that. Sometimes they agree, sometimes they don't. But how you keep that whole enterprise moving forward toward a common goal is very, very difficult. And that requires leaders who listen and who are able to synthesize different points of view and try to find commonality among people who come from different viewpoints.
Wendi, you serve on the board of the Pipeline Initiative, so I feel like you probably have a good amount to say on this subject. So,
yeah, I mean, I could talk for hours on this topic. I think I will build off of what Jeff said. I think it is an imperative moment for leaders to listen to the people in their communities and to take their cues from there. And I think that is regardless of where on the spectrum and which side of the aisle you sit on. But then the other piece that I always think is so important is showing up and actually talking to people. I think what we saw a lot of in this election is people who feel like, in honestly the last couple of cycles, people who feel like they haven't been spoken to. We talk about the success of like AOC and President Trump, and a lot of it is the same model with a different message. You're speaking directly to the people that you're trying to reach. Why are people on Twitter? Why are people following them on Instagram? It is because they want to feel like they know that person and understand how they're helping with their lives. And I think that is true at a federal level, which is a little bit harder to achieve, but it's also true at a local level. And we need all pieces of it in order to move our democracy forward.
Joe, I know this is actually a big question among a lot of our Republican friends right now about the future leaders on the Republican side, how do you see this election cycle impacting what the future of Republican leadership looks like?
Well, Trump, I think, fundamentally changed the calculus and changed the Republican Party. So a lot of the people who've been involved as Republican leaders are now coming to grips with this fact and looking at the fact, as Jeff said, he got the second most votes for president in American history. He challenged their views on a whole host of issues, and they're forced to accept that he was right on a number of them. On trade issues, for example, on reaching out to the working class, on the manufacturing, hitting on manufacturing, jobs, things like that. I mean, the Republican Party was reflexively free trade before Trump came in and became president and fundamentally changed the trade calculus, for instance. And it was interesting. Marco Rubio just made just was giving comments about how, Trump had reached out to the working class in a way that the Republican Party hadn't done before. And it's so funny to see Marco Rubio say this a week or so after the election, because he was captain establishment when he ran and Trump cleaned his clock last time. I mean, and he's coming to grips and sorting out how to reinvent himself as a champion of the working class and potentially position himself for a run again. I think they're all trying to figure that out. The other thing, to Jeff's point, it is the youth wave that came in, I think, is certainly something that the Democratic Party can take some comfort in, but the flip side of that is how volatile this situation is and how quickly people are moving around and their allegiances are getting scrambled in different ways with Twitter and with, just how society is evolving so fast. I mean, the news cycle around during this past 4 years, it was just amazing how many new dominant stories came on board. And it's going to be interesting to see how Republicans go after constituencies that supported them in higher proportions than before, and after constituencies that abandoned them this time, how they go after young people. There are a lot of women members, Republican women, who were elected to the House of Representatives. The first woman senator from Wyoming who could be a real force in the Senate. And it's just so fascinating to me to watch all these new voices and constituencies come in on the Democratic side and the Republican side and exhale after Trump, if they're able to do that. I mean, he's going to be still tweeting. I don't think there's any doubt about that. He's going to be hanging over the Republican Party. But how do they take what he demonstrated on substance and much of his message, jettison a lot of the parts that people found so offensive, and move forward? And it's just going to be fascinating to watch how leaders step up. The last thing I'd say too, just generally speaking for both parties, I want to see leaders who can start to converse with the other side in a respectful way, and kind of chill out the perpetual outrage machine on each side. So if Biden says something positive about Cuba, I would prefer that he not be called a communist ready to trade American secrets and give Cuba nuclear weapons and all this stuff, which it certainly would happen if he were to say, I like the weather down there or something. I mean, and it would be nice if Mitch McConnell weren't called, all sorts of filthy names by the Democratic side. If he makes a comment that some people are able to parse and find objectionable. The same thing about, one of the things when Eric Holder was Attorney General and he said, America we're cowards about race, and the guy was pounded. And I just thought, why is that a controversial statement? Why can't we as a country have a conversation about race? And he ended up having to retract that statement. I just don't see why we're not able to have conversations in this country when we disagree and not be screaming or forced to apologize all the time for things that people want to parse and attribute the worst attributes or the worst motivations to comments or statements, sometimes made by mistake, sometimes misspoken, but sometimes genuinely trying to move people's thinking forward. And it would be nice if leaders could treat the American people respectfully and each other respectfully in those discussions.
I think we all like want to head in that direction. We have a question from the audience. This is from Abel, sorry, a Coro Fellows Program alum and a former member of the Oakland City Council. We had record turnout this election. How will campaigns and other institutions going forward ensure that this level of participation continues? And what specific strategies need to be employed to keep people engaged in the democratic process, particularly in an off year? Wendi, do you want to take this one first, or?
I'll start by saying I don't believe in off years. So
That's picked on you.
I knew that's why you picked me, so didn't want to disappoint. I think what I would say is the same thing I say all the time, which is there's usually always something happening. I think Jeff mentioned it earlier that like what we saw in Georgia and Arizona was the result of 10 years of constant organizing. I think people should, hopefully this level of energy will mean that more people get involved in their communities and they participate in that ongoing organizing. One of the reasons I don't believe in off years is because one, gubernatorials are happening every year, but two, so are mayorals, so are city council races. You know, somebody reached out to me today about a finance director for a Boston mayoral race that is happening, I think, next year. So there's always something to be done. And I am hopeful that at a local and state level, we'll be able to continue to engage a lot of these people who turned out and who volunteered on these campaigns to keep them as part of the process. So that's what I'll say.
Great. Jeff, why don't you take it next?
Well, look, I think people turn out when they view elections as mattering, and whether you were for Trump or against Trump this time, people perceived that this election mattered. There was something at stake. And, you know, I think it is incumbent on both parties and the candidates they recruit and support to demonstrate to voters why these elections on an ongoing basis matter. And, you know, too often voters, particularly young people, and, you know, I was involved in campaigns that were heavily reliant on the votes of young people. You know, young people and particularly young people of color often view elections as not mattering, not having a direct impact on their lives or their futures. And that's what, you know, that is why we need candidates, and this is true of Republicans as well as Democrats, candidates who can speak to people and to explain, and Trump had success with this, with working class voters in some parts of the country, explaining why what he wanted to do was going to have a material benefit to their lives. And, you know, on the Democratic side, we often get lost in 90-page policy papers and symposiums and, you know, HR 4938 on page 596, line 2, it says this. Like, you know, you have to have, you may have a 90-page plan, but it's got to be on it. You got to be able to put it on a bumper sticker. Now you have to have more than a bumper sticker. You got to have the plan too, but you got to have both. And you have to be able to explain to people in language that, you know, people will relate to in culturally competent ways in many communities, how it is that this election actually matters in your day-to-day life.
Awesome. Joe?
Yeah, I can't disagree with what Wendi or Jeff said. You know, but I'll flip it a little bit. It would, if we had sustained economic growth, no pandemic, and no military conflicts, turnout would go down. And wouldn't that be a great price to pay? You know, that would be, frankly, you know, peace, tranquility, people functioning as a peaceful society. That'd be great. And a lot of Americans would decide not to go to the polls in that environment. They would not be motivated. Maybe they'd go hunting if they're in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan instead of going to the polls. Maybe they would do something else if they were in San Francisco that day. But the point is, I think this election was viewed as mattering to a lot of people on both sides of the aisle and a lot of new voters as well. It's going to be difficult for the Democrats to maintain that level of intensity. I think it's going to be difficult for Republicans, don't get me wrong, but it's always, you win and you get to pop the champagne corks and everybody gets to dance, and then you got to run the place. And it's always good to just take a deep breath and remember, enjoy the moment, but this is the high. The next thing happens, you got a cabinet official who blows up, you've got a military conflict, you've got a public health challenge, you've got something, and now, it's going to be tough. And for Joe Biden, who will not run for re-election, and isn't the most exciting human being to ever occupy the White House, it's going to be difficult for people to stay motivated and engaged. And the challenge for the Democrats, I think, is to create a compelling vision around the other leaders in the party to say, stay involved. And for Republicans, look, it's brutal for them to figure out, you watch this dance, how do we deal with Trump leaving the stage? How do we deal with Trump in some ways freed up and more powerful than he was as president? Because he doesn't have to do anything for McConnell or anything anymore. He can sit down in Mar-a-Lago, wake up in the morning, send out 40 tweets, hit the course, and come back and blow other people up with tweets. So it's going to be very difficult for Republicans to maintain level of Trump support, but still carve their own way.
Julie, how do you see Biden helping to keep this enthusiasm going?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Jeff had said earlier, right? The coalition, keeping the coalition together is never an easy effort. But I think it's an important one. And I think it is about, being able to build an administration that's reflective of that broader coalition and reflective and representative of the communities and the coalition of voters that, helped to elect him and Kamala, and continuing to do the work. I think, what we saw, at least in terms of, his track record, is in 2009, he led the recovery effort. And that was, extremely significant and had a material impact on people's lives. So I think the challenge for us moving forward is, how do we make sure that we're translating government into that material impact? How are we showing people the, tangible ways that their vote matters, and the fact that that this is going to be a fundamentally different administration when we're looking at issues like COVID and PPE and administering PPP, and how those funds get down to our small, especially minority-owned businesses. And so I think there's a lot of important work that we have ahead of us, and the challenge is ours. But I think the encouraging part that I saw from the electorate this cycle is that young voters turned out in record numbers, and I'm really encouraged by that. I think that it shows a commitment and a beginning of kind of a longer term kind of lifelong commitment to voting. And we always say, as Democrats, it's important to start to get them engaged early. And this year we were able to also have a historic number of folks vote early. That's not something for especially many communities of color that we've ever really been able to achieve. And so, starting to really, create new pathways and opportunities, and root in new cultures and new ways of voting for our communities. And that's something that we're going to need to continue to do. But in reality, I think a lot of the lessons learned coming out of this is that we invested in communities of color and turning out voters of color in ways that we haven't as a party before. And it was significant investment. It was early investment. It was sustained investment. And we didn't just treat them as like a, turnout universe or get out the vote universe. We really began connecting with them early on, and in language, not just in Spanish, but in multiple API languages. We also, did advertising and paid media in, Indian country and throughout Indian country. And so it really was, focused on the broader coalition that we knew was going to be important to not just winning, but then putting us in a position to be able to move forward an important agenda.
That's great. So we've got a question from Dana from the Women in Leadership Coro alum. She's a Coro alum. Can you share with us any tools or strategies that you have found useful in building positive relationships with people that you either don't agree with, or whether in your personal or your professional lives? So if you don't agree with them personally or professionally. Joe, I think you touched on this first, so I'm going to let you go. I'm going to let you go first on this one.
So yeah, I mean, look, I've always been outnumbered. An Irish Catholic Republican from Albany, New York. You go to college, you're outnumbered. I lived in California, I was outnumbered. I was outnumbered in law school, and I'm certainly outnumbered in Washington, D.C. The thing is, there's a tremendous amount of agreement on most aspects of daily life, separate and distinct from politics. And thank God. I mean, thank God you can go to the farmer's market and say, do those apples look good? Or are the price of those eggs outrageous? Or how are the kids doing in school? I've always been fortunate in Washington, D.C. that I've been able to develop friendships with Democrats and liberals. I just think that the deal is you just have to interact with people as human beings and find all the common ground. And when you hit something that freaks people out, you just say, okay, we're not gonna, maybe it comes from coming from an Irish Catholic family where there's just enough dysfunction that there are certain subjects you can't bring up after certain members have had 6 or 8 or 14 beers. And, that's how you deal as a human being with issues that you disagree with. I would say, I think the demonization of people on the other side has got to stop. Generally speaking, just getting on Twitter to go absolutely bonkers and attack people, even sometimes when they're in your own political affiliation orbit and they say something that's kind about a member of the opposite party or people of a different ideology. All this stuff has got to stop, and we've got to control ourselves. It's really easy to fire off tweets and messages like this on Facebook that are inflammatory, and it's somewhat, in some weird, twisted way, we get some level of satisfaction out of firing these things off. But they're not healthy for us as individuals. They're not healthy for the people who receive them, and they're not healthy for society. And I hope we get to a point where we can recognize that as Americans, we have far more in agreement than we do disagreement. President Trump agreed with Bernie Sanders about trade policy, for instance, largely, or many aspects of it. And there is a lot of areas where people can disagree and still agree to be cordial to one another.
Wendi, I know you work across the aisle with the RGA and many other people in office. What are some tools you use?
So I honestly feel the same way about dealing with people across the aisle as I feel about learning a foreign language or exercising, right? The longer you go without doing it, the harder it is to do. I think it is healthy and important for us to have friends and interact, as Joe was saying, with people across the aisle. I think the level of Twitter and online interaction dehumanizes people, and it helps people just feel like they can say any old thing. It's like when a coworker sends you an email that's like too hot and angry, and you pick up the phone and call them and then they back down. It's like that. And so what I try to do is have as much, before COVID, when I used to see people in person, as much like in-person time as possible. I will say I don't, when you work for Planned Parenthood, you don't keep as many Republican friends as I probably should. But I do like to take the opportunities that I'm presented with to interact with people across the aisle really seriously and try to build those relationships.
Julie, how are you doing it now that you're in the middle of a transition?
Well, I haven't necessarily embarked on it in the context of the transition yet, but I look forward to those opportunities. I will say though, it's just, I think for me, some of the richest lessons that I had learned working in the last administration was actually, the importance of really bringing together unusual allies to help to move whatever policy agenda we had forward. And immigration was a big piece of that. And I remember, at one point I was tasked with, bringing in a lot of the evangelical faith community. And so at the time, Russell Moore was the head of the Southern Baptist Convention, and he and I developed a great relationship on the areas of immigration. We didn't talk about anything else because I was, not sure what else to venture into, but it was an issue that he felt deeply about and saw, the important kind of moral perspective of. The same with, working with members of the law enforcement community, whether it's on immigration or criminal justice reform or other things. It just, for me, it's always about just being able to find those areas of commonality. As Joe mentioned, I do think that we have a lot more in common than what separates us. And it's just finding those areas and being able to kind of build a sense of relationship and human connection and see the humanity in that and try to have that be kind of the root. So it's I think it's important.
And Jeff, I'm going to end this question with you because you I think you have such a way with words, and the way we became friends and got to know each other was sitting there just hashing out things. And I was amazed to see your ability to really just see things from all angles. And so can you talk about some of the tools you use to do that?
Yeah, look, I think, whatever the sphere is, if you want to have contact with people who aren't like you, it's so easy these days with the internet to put yourself in a bubble of people who just like you. They look like you, they think like you, they have only the same interests as you. You have to be very intentional about not falling into that bubble. I grew up in a small town, and just like Joe's family, like you were with the people you were with, and some of them were conservative, some of them were wild-eyed liberals, some of them were in the middle, some of them didn't care. But this is just the group of people that you had to interact with, because that's who was around you, right? And we have that in our families too. Fun Thanksgiving dinners with extended family. But it's too easy now to slip into the space where you are just isolated with people who only, it's very, very easy. It's very comfortable. I have a store, not to shamelessly plug my store, but I have a store and people do play Magic the Gathering, which some of you younger people might know what that is. It's a card game. People come in there, there's socialists in there, there's libertarians in there, there's Trump supporters in there, there's Joe Biden supporters in there, there's black people, there's white people, there's men, there's women, there's Latinos, there's straight people, and like everybody's in there having fun around something that they all enjoy in common. And that's what we need to do. Look for more opportunities to engage with people who are not like you in every respect around things that you enjoy. And to the extent that we can do that, we can avoid what Joe was talking about. It's really becoming like, Europe in the 1500s, 1600s, where somebody's, if somebody was if one was a Protestant, one was a Catholic, that was it. The conversation was over. There was nothing to talk about, and maybe I had to kill you. We can't get to that point in this country. It really is true. We are a big family in many ways, and we're going to have vehement disagreements. But really, folks, look for opportunities to engage with people who are not like you in every respect around things that you have in common with those people.
I always find I learn a lot from people who don't think exactly the same way that I do, that coming at a problem sometimes from a totally different perspective helps me think about how I'm actually thinking about a problem and frees up some of that space in my head. So tons of questions, but we're gonna do one last speed question to pull it all together. That is, what is one action item that you'd like the audience to take away today to help strengthen our democracy? Let's go with Wendi, Joe, Julie, Jeff.
Sure. Mine is easy. Stay involved and participate at a local level. You will always find something to do. And I think everyone should be engaged civically and politically at the local level.
I think we should all visit Jeff's comic book store and sit around and play some games together. No, seriously, I think it is the last question. I think we've got to, on a human level, engage with people we disagree with respectfully and figure out how to do that and not rip each other apart, not resort to insults, name calling, and or violence. That's the challenge on a human level in our families, in our neighborhoods, in our cities and towns. And that's our challenge in our parties and in Washington, D.C. at the state level as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo those two things, right? And to not be too cliche, but really, you know, in this moment, like each one of us really being the change and, you know, both in terms of our personal actions and engagement and, you know, how we choose to reach out to others, but then also in terms of expanding, you know, how we're thinking about things and ways in which we're really, you know, building, I think, important coalitions to move our country forward, because I think that's the commitment that we all have and that we all share. And I think that that's, you know, it's not insignificant and it could be an important starting point for those conversations. So.
Yeah, so I would say, you know, engage in politics vigorously but civilly. You know, I'll get back to the comic book store. There's an old Warner Brothers cartoon with the sheepdog and the coyote who beat each other up all day, and then they like punch out and they hang out and have dinner or have lunch or whatever. Like, you know, when you're engaged in politics, you engage seriously because it matters. But that does not mean that you need to dehumanize the person across the table from you. And you know, I think it is true what you said, Jenna, is that sometimes when you talk to people of different perspectives, you actually find ideas for how to solve problems within your own ideological or principled framework. So I do think there's opportunities to have common ground. You know, too often we all get caught in our own little labels and corners and policy prescriptions. And I do think that there are ways to do it in a principled way. That doesn't mean selling out your values or your principles, but operating in an environment where you treat other people with respect, and maybe you can find some common ground on some things.
Awesome. Well, before I turn it over to Laney, I'm going to give my answer, which is listen and then have empathy. And I feel that when I shut my mouth and I listen to what somebody has to say, and then I think deeply about how they're feeling and how they're coming at a problem and why they're coming at a problem from that direction, I feel like I am able to see things from their viewpoint, and it allows me to engage in a more human way. So that's my 2 cents. And now I'm going to hand it over to Laney to close us out. I want to thank all of you guys and gals. Sorry, I'm getting better at things for doing this tonight. I know how busy you all are, and it means a lot to me. And thank you very much.
Pleasure to be here.
Thanks so much, Jenna. You know, to wrap us up, I'm really struck by many things from this conversation, but there's one thing that a point that Wendi made, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase you on this, Wendi, but at the beginning of our conversation, you said, you know, we hope that we can grow from this, but growth doesn't happen on its own and it requires leadership. And I just want to say thank you so much to the 5 of you because you've been so generous tonight with your time and your expertise, and also just sharing what you think leaders need to do to bring people together across differences. And I think, as all of you noted, it's healthy and important for us to engage and interact and ask questions and to find opportunities to humanize each other. And, you know, that can be a really tall task. But thank you for modeling that for all of us today. It was a really rich conversation, so thank you. And Coro grads on the call, I want to just remind you to keep using your training to do this. And for everyone else, practicing and getting new tools for working and leading across difference is the work that we do in our programs. And so check us out, because we've got a lot of great opportunities to put this into practice, because we need more people leading at all levels and in all sectors that are able to do this. Jenna, I want to say thank you to you for being such an incredible moderator, such an incredible board member, and extending your network with us. Thanks to our team, to Shia and to Jean Ann for bringing this event to life today. And thanks to all of you, to our Coro community, for your time and attention and your ongoing dedication to just improving the quality of life in our communities in so many different ways. Thanks again for being part of this event. You can sign up for our newsletter if you want to learn about future events and other programmatic opportunities. And big thanks to everyone, and be well and stay safe and healthy.